G'day everyone, and welcome to my ANZAC portrait series. I'm artist Wayne Dowsent, and beside me is my latest ANZAC portrait of 95-year-old Lloyd Moule. Lloyd served with the 2nd 3rd Anti Tank Regiment, and in this video we pick up Lloyd's story after he's been captured by the Germans in the Middle East. Ladies and gentlemen, would you please enjoy part 2 of our interview with Mr. Lloyd Moule.
From the airfields, they were to put us in junkers, the German transport planes that had brought their soldiers in, and they were to fly us to Germany. Well, thank the good Lord, there was something that intervened, some action intervened, and they cancelled that. So they took us then down to the wharves and put us on a troop ship that had brought Italian troops over. And they sent us back. There again we were fortunate because the whole area where they had to go was mined, and we got through unscathed. And all we had was straw, laying on straw, and everybody got lousy. So the Italian soldiers must have been lousy, because when we arrived over in Italy proper, everybody was scratching and that. We looked in our clothes and we had these lice, lots of lice. And for days it became quite an occupation, sitting down with your underclothes, getting these lice. But it must have been crawling with them. So that's the hygiene of the Italian soldier from Capua.
You were transported to Salmona.
Salmona.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was done by train. And we travelled first class in that, of course. We were quite upmarket, travelling in style. And Salmona became a sort of a static camp for a while. We remained at Salmona and built a tunnel there. There was a tunnel that was built under with the pretence of wanting gear to make gardens. And that impressed the captors that we were going to make gardens and then perhaps be able to feed ourselves. So they brought in all this gardening gear, including picks and mattocks and rakes and everything else. And that was left there, and at night that was used to make the tunnel. So we selected hut 19, if I remember rightly, and they were prefabricated huts. Even the floorboards, the floor and the whole lot. So you could lift up a section of the floor, and that's where we tunnelled. Now, the getting rid of the surplus dirt, of course, was the problem. That's where the gardens came in. But these gardens are getting growing in style. The good thing that they were the dumb Italians. Otherwise, they'd have woke up that these gardens are growing in size all the time. However, we got away with that, and the tunnel, it went down maybe, I don't know, 4 feet or something like that, and then it was tunnelled for quite a distance under the hut, and where it came out was just through the wire, just a few feet through the wire. Now, 19 people escaped from that tunnel. 19 got out, and but eventually 19 were captured, all were recaptured, but there were some various good tales told by those that were captured and brought back of their short freedom. And then of course there was no more gardening. They confiscated the gardening tills and no more tunnelling. But some fellas became very desperate. I remember one poor fella, he was so desperate. We had straw-filled palliasses, on which to sleep. And he picked up his palliasse and he ran. And the wire fence wasn't just a single wire. There was the centre wire, all very close strands, and then there were 2 aprons, an apron running in, and that way an apron of wire, so that it was a sort of a V-shaped thing. And one fellow became so desperate he threw his palliasse on it and tried to go over the wire. Of course, he got shot, killed. But there was a lot of desperate fellows, very desperate. I suppose they could no longer be enclosed, or be. But it never worried me. I was very fortunate. I lived from day to day, and I had a great faith, and I believed that my God would one day see me through. It was essential to have a mate. Those that didn't have a mate, the loners, they had a terrible time. But I had a mate, a big, long, lanky bloke from out the west, Bob Noble, God bless, rest his soul. And Bob was a good mate. And Bob was a tall, gangly fella. And of course, food being scarce, I could always afford to give Bob a bit of my food, something that he never ever forgot. So I must have been a good doer. I could get by on less food than the other fellows. We were faring pretty well at Salmona. The food was adequate, quite good and adequate. Macaroni, of course, that was the staple diet. So you had macaroni with the cheese cut up in it, and then later on, when things got bad, the cheese discontinued. And then there was more water added to the macaroni, so in the finish it became almost, well, if you had anything to eat, you wouldn't have eaten it. However, we survived that. From Salmona we went to Prato Isako. It's Prato Isako, I know, means meadow, so it must have been Isako Meadows.
How long were you at Prato Isako for?
I think it was only a short while before they sent us to the main prison camp. Camp Concentramento 57, that's, Jane knows what it is.
So is that
concentration camp number 57.
Okay, and is that the main concentration camp?
That was the main Camp 57. All prisoners had to full in and declare their pre-war occupations, resulted in some declaring themselves as lounge lizards, banana benders, and other occupations that I cannot repeat. They said they were bed bumpers, and I wanted to know what a bed bumper was. He said, under the bed for a lazy mole. oh, I'm sorry to have to say that. The camp commandant there was a brutal old man. He was a fascist colonel, and he was brutal. And any excuse he had, he'd take it out on the prisoners. And of course, inside the prison, they had another prison. You went into that, and if you went into that, thank the good Lord, I was never in there. But those that did, it was like a dungeon, you know, real imprisonment. Not much food, not much light, and so it there. But he was, and we also had, I must tell you about Nursey, one of the interpreters. We called him Nursey. He was a dainty little fellow, used to go about, and the colonel he say, it was always the colonel he say, you must do this. And we used to call him the little shit house. And he says, I cannot, he always had his dictionary, and I cannot find this in the dictionary. Now what does this mean? I said, il cabinetto. And that should have told him, shouldn't it, Jane? Il cabinetto, which means, you know, and he never turned a hair. It was as though it was a badge of honour for him to be called a little shit house. And then the other interpreter there we called Jock. He lived in Scotland as a child until he was 12 years old. So therefore, he spoke good English with a Scottish accent, broad Scottish accent, and so they were our two interpreters, Little Shithouse and Jock. Jock was good, and the colonel, oh yes, the old fascist colonel, Colonel Calcaterra, and I don't know what happened to him after the war. I've heard various tales, but whatever it was, it'd be too good for him.
So, can you tell me a little bit about life at the camp, at the main camp?
Yeah, well, as I said previously, that you had to have a mate. If you didn't have a mate, somebody that would look after you for a second. I had Bob Noble from out at Guerilla in southwestern New South Wales, and Bob did become very, very ill, and I think he may have carked it only for me. I'd give him some bit of extra soup and that sort of thing. And yes, so that was it. So Yes, you weren't over endowed with blankets or anything like that, so most fellas slept together, as many as you know, might be 3 or 4, all pooling your blankets and getting under, well, much in the winter time. The summers, of course, weren't too bad. I made every effort wherever I was to try and learn the language, and because I learned, I wouldn't say I spoke the language grammatically perfect by any means, but I learned the language enough, and I had a good vocabulary, and may not put it in the right order, but it was enough to get through. And as I was called Luigi by the Italians, because that's the nearest thing, the fellows adopted the name Luigi, and even today I'd meet some of them if they were still around, and they'd probably call me Luigi. Yeah. But so Luigi became my name. Yeah. Oh, Albert Farrell. He was a World War I man. He's probably saw very little service in World War I, but he was our medical orderly. And old Bert had a magnificent voice. He claimed that he sang with Dame Nellie Melba, and we found out later that was true. He did, and he used to sing opera, and of course, you know, he got the eye ties in properly, walking about with this magnificent voice, and they invited him down to the officers' mess, and he said to us, "It's all right," he said, "they plied me with food and wine and that." He said, and he did, things became a bit easier through Bert with these, entertaining them with his singing. And once he said, we'll try and impress them. When they're doing the rounds, when the big shots come in to look us over, he said, "I'll have you fellas as a choir." And he said, you know, just there, and he said, "I'll sing to them as they always want me to do. And when I want you to come in," he said, you only got to sing funiculi, funicular. So when I go like that, you'll know to come in funiculi, and anyway, oh, we've shocked poor old Bert. He nearly had a heart attack. So instead of singing funiculi, we sang musso, musso, musso on the wall. Musso, musso, musso on the wall. Pig's arse he did, pig's arse he did. Pig's arse he won the war. And old Bert standing there, ashen, almost frozen. And he said to us, "Well, you bastards, what did you do that to me for?" Musso won the war. The eye ties, of course, didn't know what we were saying, so that didn't matter. But when I escaped, that was the beginning of winter. I think it was in October that I escaped, and that was the first winter snows that had fallen, and it was bitterly cold. And so it was good. It kept us walking. You had to keep walking to keep warm.
So can you tell me how you escaped from the camp, Lloyd?
Yeah, it wasn't no dramatic escape, as it'll tell you there, right there. It wasn't actually they used to take us out in work parties, and it's just a matter of, there was confusion, you see. You remember the false armistice? Well, you mightn't recall, but there was a false armistice where they thought that Italy had capitulated, and it wasn't the case really, but we cashed in on that one, and we used to say, "La guerra finito, la guerra finito," you know, the war is finished. And we had them convinced and finished, la guerra had finito, that the war was finished, and so then it was just a matter of walking away, you know. That's nothing dramatic at all.
So how many of you escaped?
I can't put a number on it, but there were quite a lot. Everybody can walk, made a dash for it. During my time as an escapee, I came to a farmhouse, and I startled the dear old lady there, and she wanted to know who I was, and I told her I was a prigioniero de guerra, and she said, mio figlio prigionieri in Australia. And of course her son was a prisoner in Australia, and he was being well cared for. So therefore she took me in and gave me victuals. Yeah. After our escape, we went back to the area where we'd worked. So a lot of the time was spent up in a hayloft. That was a big loft above the cattle stalls, and that's where they had their hay. So a lot of the time was spent there, and the children in the little village we were in, they knew that we were there, but the local people were absolutely amazingly wonderful to treat an ex-enemy the way they did. And these little kids, when the German troops had come through, they'd come through with a motorcycle and probably a couple of carloads or truckloads of German soldiers, and these little kids would run in and say, "Tedeschi, Tedeschi, Tedeschi," that's Germans, Germans, and then we'd know to make to our hideout above the cattle stalls and hide there until the all clear. But this went on for quite a time, so everybody in the village, I think, was in the know of who we were, and we were fooling the German, thank goodness, yeah. But the civilians, they looked after us well. They'd cook rice and barley and give us that, and we caught Rani's frog. So there was plenty of frogs there, so we'd catch the frogs, and then we'd eat them with the rice.
How would you catch a frog?
How do you catch them? Well, first of all you kill a frog, and then you make a large bait of it, more than they can swallow, put it on a string, and go, and they come to that, that's the noise they make, and you dangle it over, they're gluttonous things, and once they got hold of the bait, they wouldn't let go. So you had to bring them up, break their two hind legs and put them in your Rani bag, that's the frog bag, the Rani bag, and we sort of fed ourselves on frogs.
What does a frog taste like?
Tastes like chicken, yeah. Tasted damn good, I can tell you, in those days. And having abandoned our prison uniform, of course, we put civvies on, which were given to us by the kindly Italians. And, I was well turned out. I had a Borsellino hat, which is high quality, and I had a tailored coat. It was a bit large for me. I was made for a portly man. And the old trousers left a bit to be desired, but that didn't matter. Up top I looked quite smart. Rita Perazzo. Rita was the only child and daughter of the Padrone, and the Padrone's the old guy that owned the farm. But he was leaning a bit our way too, I think. He shut his eyes to a lot of things, and he couldn't be involved, of course, because of his position in the town. And so anyway, Margaret, was a very brave and beautiful young woman. She was the go-between, and she helped us. She led us to a place called San Germano. We made contact with the officers of the Partigiani, and Wide Duty was then made. We detoured and went to a place called Borgosesia. There was a force of 25 partisans, 30 females, and where the males were officers of the Alpini troops. They were good officers, good soldiers, the Alpinis. And it was a well-organised camp, and we Aussies were fed and later armed. With two Italians, I was detailed to remove from under a harvested crop of maize a cache of weapons, including light machine guns in perfect condition, having been wrapped in cloth and canvas, but unfortunately no tripod. So we had to carry them, we had to use them Rambo style. Yeah.
So when you were working with the Partigiano,
yeah.
What kind of guerrilla tactics did you do against the Germans?
Well, it was more of a sabotage. You got to, but anyway, anything that you could do to disrupt the Germans, we did. But the Partigiani were more active on the killing side of it than we were, and but I dare say I might have shot a German or two. But however, they were out to kill the Tedeschi, the Germans, which they did very successfully. And I think it would have intimidated the Germans, knowing they're coming into a village and knowing what the consequences might be. So eventually the German raids became less. I was then equipped with my Carabinieri revolver, if I included that.
No,
a
talk about that. Yeah.
A big chrome Carabinieri revolver. And that I carried that with much difficulty in my belt because it was fairly heavy. But it wasn't a good firing pin, and you had to shake it a couple of times to to get the firing pin into position before it would fire. We'd been sprung. Somebody had tipped them off, and we got word that because the Italians were wonderful, I suppose it was the underground really, and they tipped us off that the Germans were going to raid. So I ended up boarding a coach that was going north. It was too full, and the driver was trying to protest us not getting on, but there was somebody up on the top, and I got up on the top with him in the roof rack.
Lloyd joined a partisan base camp in the Biella and Aosta areas when anticipated airdrops of food and ammunition did not eventuate, and as winter was on the way, Lloyd and 6 others decided to attempt to cross the Alps. For 6 hours they headed into the hills in a northwesterly direction before confronting a young boy.
Yes, I still believe my angel. It was a young Italian boy, I'd say about 10 or 11, dark hair, brown eyes, swarthy skin, quite a handsome kid. And he appeared where you would be surprised to even see any other human being up in this wild mountain, and he was there. You can imagine the shock that I got to see a person, particularly a boy. And he said to me, "Dove andare?" That's where you're going. And I told him, and he says, "Non andare qua, molti tedeschi là." Don't go there, many tedeschi there. And I said to the blokes, he reckons there's plenty of Germans down there, and they said, "Don't believe that's a bloody trap. It'll lead us into a trap." And I said, "No, we're not going there." And he began to cry. Now, a child or a person who had never seen me before started to cry when giving me that advice. And I said to the fellows, "Well, that's good enough for me. No, it's good enough for me. That's proof that this kid is genuine." So anyway, we went where he told us, and it led us to safety. But much as we inquired about him, when we tell the Italians, they say, which boy? Which boy? Nobody knew that person. Now, can you explain that? I can't. And it wasn't a figment of my imagination. I wasn't that far gone. But there was this child in that unlikely place telling us not to go there. That saved our lives.